The case on both sides of today's issue, the merits of making illegal drugs legal, is often strongly put. Those opposed see an outcome this way. Making drugs easier to obtain will cause drug use to soar. Everyone will pay the price of increased drug use. There will be more drug-related accidents on the highway and at work. Drug-related crime will increase. More drug-addicted babies will be born. More children will drop out of school, and productivity in the workforce will fall. Arguments in favor include this kind of a statement made in a speech a couple of years ago. The principal reason why illegal drugs like cocaine and heroin are as harmful as they are is not simply because of their physiological or psychological properties, but because of the vicious, racist, anti-democratic, and just plain stupid way our society has dealt with drugs. And in the midst of this debate, the adverse consequences of illegal drugs in the Portland region and the nation expand. Drive-by killings, fear in our schools, mounting public safety costs, rising HIV infections, and the impact on the economy. For many, we seem to be losing the war on drugs. Is legalizing illegal drugs the panacea, or even an important part of the solution? Our two speakers today will help us with the answer. Attorney John Henry Hingson, who will speak first, believes the only way society can win this war is through legalization and careful education. Mr. Hingson speaks with long experience as a specialist in criminal defense cases. In addition to his practice based in Oregon City, Mr. Hingson has a national perspective, gained as past president of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. He was also president of the Oregon chapter of Criminal Defense Lawyers Association. He's a graduate of the University of Texas Law School. Our second speaker, Barry Sheldahl, believes that to be effective, drug treatment and drug education need law enforcement, and that we can't afford to legalize drugs. Mr. Sheldahl is currently Assistant United States Attorney for the Oregon District. He received his law degree from the University of Oregon. Mr. Sheldahl was formerly a Deputy District Attorney for Multnomah County for more than a decade and tried, among other things, capital murder cases. He has served as a member of the Governor's Drug and Violent Crime Policy Board. Please join me in welcoming our two speakers to the Portland City Club.
First, I'd like to tell you what this debate is not about. This debate is not about advocating the use of controlled substances by adults. I miss John Belushi. This debate is not about the advocacy of the use of controlled substances by children. The purple haze of marijuana smoke has no place in our schools. From kindergarten all the way through the institutions of truly higher learning. This debate is not about opposing the imposition of criminal sanctions on those who harm others while under the influence of controlled substances. The loss of life of a child to a drugged or drunken driver is a sorrowful experience that none of us should have to suffer. What this debate is about is whether or not the use of the criminal sanction is effective in reducing drug use and drug abuse in this nation. I suggest to you that the use of the criminal sanction has had an awfully long time to work, and it has failed. There are now more than 330,000 Americans behind bars for violating drug laws. We are spending $20 billion a year on criminal justice approaches to this problem. Illegal drugs are available in greater supply and greater purity than ever before. Despite the fact that there is no evidence that marijuana has ever caused a single death, and that there is clear evidence that it is useful in some medical circumstances, the federal government continues to spend millions of dollars each year to eradicate plants. And according to the FBI, 535,000 people were arrested for possession of sale, manufacture, and use of marijuana. In 1991, the General Accounting Office reported that the Pentagon's interdiction efforts, which cost taxpayers close to $1 billion during the previous 2 years, had no impact on the flow of drugs. In all, there are 440,000 prisoners in local jails, 840,000 in prisons, state prisons, 87,000 in federal prisons, and add to that 2.7 million people on probation, more than 500,000 on parole. That figure represents the highest proportion of the American population incarcerated in our entire history, as well as the highest proportion incarcerated of any country in the world. The fundamental reason that the criminal sanction has not worked in reducing drug abuse and drug use is that a substantial number of our society do not believe that it's right to make it a crime to get high. Let me repeat that. The fundamental reason that the criminal penalties do not work in solving the drug use and abuse problem in this country is that a substantial number of our population do not believe it should be a crime to get high. We have experienced with the repeal of prohibition a commitment in this country that it is okay to get high on something, alcohol. When a criminal sanction has no popular support in the morals and the mores of a society, the criminal sanction is doomed to failure. A criminal sanction without support in the morals and mores of a society will not control the behavior of the masses. You people are not deterred by a statute book that says that it's a crime to steal. That doesn't work with you. The thing that keeps you from stealing from one another is the way that you were raised. It's wrong to steal. It's in the commandments. It's part of our Judeo-Christian ethic. If we're going to attack this problem intelligently, we need to attack this problem personally and not through governmental intervention. You know, I'm a relatively recent parent with a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. And in contemplating parenthood and in experiencing parenthood, I've often thought about who the best teacher is. I can rely upon my own experience. The best teacher for me was my mother. My father wasn't in the home a large part of my life. She instilled in me values that I hope are reflected today. It became popular during the days of Lyndon Johnson to think that government could take the place of parenting. That lesson, that is wrong, should not be forgotten. The Soviet Union couldn't raise children in the governmental fashion. The Chinese can't do it. People have to raise their children to become moral and honest and law-abiding citizens. The fear of the criminal sanction does not work and cannot work with this serious problem. We have experienced something that has been called a war, both on crime and on drugs. I saw the beginning of that war here in Portland, Oregon, when the Drug Abuse Law Enforcement Agency began its activities under the presidency of Richard Nixon. He declared a war on crime and a war on drugs. The war is still going on. Victory is not at the end of the tunnel, and peace is not at hand. I would like to talk to you about some of the casualties of this war, because they're very, very real, and because of my unique perspective in working in the emergency room of the courtroom. I want to tell you about some realities that you may not know about. Is there a doctor in the house? Did you know that the United States Supreme, every case I'm going to talk about, virtually every case I'm going to talk to you about, Barry knows them all, virtually every case I'm going to talk to you about arose from a drug prosecution. Did you know that the United States Supreme Court declared that it was legal for drug enforcement agents to go into Mexico without extradition papers and to kidnap a doctor from Mexico and drag him across the border for trial in the United States on narcotics charges? Doctor, members of the City Club, how would you like it if Mexican DE agents came into this room and took you here down south for a trial in Tampico without ever having an opportunity to go to court to say something is wrong? That is one of the casualties of the war on drugs in the international community. Police can stop and detain people driving cars without any suspicion that they have committed any crime. The United States Supreme Court has said that's okay. Why? Because they stop everybody. They are not discriminating against anyone. People who travel on public transportation facilities like buses fare no better. Police can come onto a bus and ask you for your papers and ask to search your luggage. There is no problem. That passes constitutional muster in this country. A prosecutor who hides evidence of a citizen's actual innocence from a grand jury and obtains a bogus rubber stamp indictment in that fashion cannot be second-guessed by a judge. Federal judges are powerless to throw out indictments where prosecutors have intentionally hidden evidence of a defendant's innocence from the grand jury that indicted him or her. What was the United States Supreme Court's response? You'll find justice from the trial jury, folks. They'll acquit you if you're really innocent. Never mind the fact that the grand jury may never have indicted you had the full and complete truth been revealed. Prosecutors can knowingly present perjured testimony to convict citizens in this country and are absolutely immune from responding in federal civil rights money damages. And finally, a jury in a criminal case during deliberations drank wine, ordered pizza, drank beer, and sniffed cocaine. And the United States Supreme Court held that a lawyer representing a client so convicted may not present such evidence in order to impeach that jury verdict. These are the casualties of the war on crime and the war on drugs as I see them from my perspective. There are more. The tremendous amount of money that we are spending on interdiction and the criminal approach to attacking the controlled substance use and abuse problem in this country saps money from education. We spend more to incarcerate someone for a year than we spend to educate them for a year. In my community, we have in the educational system, the public educational system, for my children, no computers, no music, and no sports. If that isn't a recipe for juvenile delinquency, I don't know how to cook. The billions and billions of dollars spent on the criminal sanction have done nothing to reduce the supply of illegal drugs in this country. Our military after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, had a lot to do, had a lot of time on their hands. Now the military is involved in this war on drugs. This is changing the entire complexion of civilian law enforcement in this nation. That is very dangerous, folks. Having the military involved in civilian law enforcement is one of the reasons the founders revolted and formed this country. Are there any solutions? Well, of course there are. We can stop wasting our money on the use of the criminal sanction. We can embrace the concept proposed recently by Interpol for decriminalization of marijuana and other soft drugs. We can treat this problem for what it is. I know that there are some alcoholics in this room, and the difference between alcoholism and drug abuse is merely the substance, not the essence of the problem. This is a medical problem, and it is a disease. It is time we started treating this disease from a medical approach and a medical model. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We don't need any more money to throw at some study group to figure that out. Let's prevent this problem rather at the beginning, rather than hammer it with money at the end and incarcerate thousands and thousands of people at a cost of billions and billions of dollars. And one thing that we can stop doing is we can stop trying to pass the buck to government. We need to take individual responsibility in our own homes, with our own children and with one another. The solutions don't lie in the courtroom, they lie in the living room. We must teach our children well and live by example. And when those among us transgress and act stupid, we need to talk to one another about how stupid we're acting. We need to help one another. We need to stop calling people names. We need to join hands together and solve this problem with intelligence rather than viciousness. Politicians have made a lot of hay with this issue. A lot of them have been elected as a result of demagoguery and mean-spiritedness. I think it's time to turn our back on that kind of an attitude, and as we do, remember and recall the words of a beautiful mythical poet who wrote, "No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee."
You didn't hear in the introduction that John Henry is also a great tuba player. Thought I would add that. First, I'd like to thank members of the club for inviting me today to speak on this important topic. Secondly, I must make the obligatory statement that my views today are my own, not those of the Department of Justice necessarily, although I hope they support much of what I say today. This is an interesting debate. It's truly nonpartisan. Luminaries such as William Buckley, George Shultz, former Secretary of State, support John Henry's position on legalization. John Henry, that's probably the only time you and William Buckley will agree. On the other side, on the side that opposes legalization, are Charles Rangel, a congressman from New York, and William Bennett, former Secretary of Education. I once heard a person debating this subject on taking my side of the issue and he said he would really like to debate George Shultz. He thought for a minute and said he wasn't so sure about Buckley. And with that in mind, I'd like to emphasize at the beginning that even though I'm advocating continued criminalization of drugs, it's important that we have treatment and education as well. And sometimes the proponents of legalization present you with a false choice. They suggest that you either have criminal penalties or you focus on education and treatment. In fact, we need all three. All three are very important. For example, addicts don't come in off the street and say, "Treat me, I want help." What they want are drugs. That's why they're addicts. We come into contact with addicts frequently in the court system, frequently in the criminal courts. And what the criminal courts can do with those addicts, it's a carrot and stick approach. It's the threat of sanctions, it's the threat of jail beds that can coerce them into treatment programs through probation, supervision, parole, prison drug programs. Multnomah County has a very successful dedicated drug court, it's called, becoming nationally recognized, and they use the criminal sanctions right up front to get the addicts into treatment, and if they succeed after 12 months, their charges are dismissed. That's how the criminal justice system can help treatment. The law, too, is a good educator. Children, when asked, "Why don't you use drugs?" in many surveys, over 70% say, "Because it's illegal." I make that point just to suggest that all three systems have to work together. And why do we have this impetus for legalization? I think in large part it's frustration. I think you heard some of it this afternoon. We have declared various wars on drugs for over a decade now. It's probably a bad term to use, the term war on drugs, but we all know that there's still heroin out on the street today. There's still cocaine out there. There's still marijuana. And so, out of frustration, many people say, "Gosh, that hasn't worked. Let's give up. Let's give up on that stuff. Let's try something else." Well, I submit that argument is wrong, and it's probably just frustration. For example, we spend a lot of money solving bank robberies. We spend a lot of money solving murders. We spend a lot of money prosecuting robbers and murderers. We still have robbers. We still have murderers, and we're going to have them. But nobody stands up and says, "Gosh, let's give up and say that robbery's legal." Kind of a silly argument. Secondly, all is not bad news on the war on drugs. There's some very encouraging news. We haven't won, but Oregon, every 2 years, surveys its 8th graders and its 11th graders for drug use. From 1986 to 1992, cocaine use among 11th graders in Oregon has dropped over 83%. Marijuana use has dropped 51%. Amphetamine use has dropped 53%. Those are pretty good numbers. There's a ways to go. The FBI keeps track of violent crime, serious crime. They have an index of serious crimes. They've kept it for a long time. 1988 in Oregon, we had over 7,000 crimes per 100,000 per capita population in Oregon. 1992, that's dropped to 5,800 per 100,000 people. It's over a 15% drop in violent crime. You don't get that impression when you watch the news today or watch television, but those are very good numbers and very encouraging. The National Household Survey conducted by the federal government reflected a 20% drop in drug usage between 1991 and 1992 in the homes across the country. The people advocating legalization say the war on drugs is too expensive. Lee Brown, the current drug czar, former sheriff of Multnomah County, estimates that this year, 1994, war on drugs is going to cost the government $13.2 billion. It was Everett Dirksen who said $1 million here and $1 million there. Pretty soon it adds up. That's a lot of money. But here we are in the post-Cold War era, and the Defense Department budget is still about $260 billion. And a number I can't get out of my head as I was preparing for this discussion today. Last year, Americans spent $4 billion on air conditioning. So the fact that we're putting $13 billion in a war on drugs, and that includes treatment, education, and the criminal justice system, we're not straining ourselves. I think it's important to ask the legalizers, what is it they're proposing? Some on the fringe just say no controls at all. The manufacture, delivery, and use of drugs is free. There would be no criminal sanctions whatsoever. The cartels would love that. They would have free rein in a wider market. The more reasoned approach seems to be controlled legalization. And I think by that they mean that the government is going to develop a program where we will give drugs to addicts, we'll give them heroin, we'll give them cocaine, we'll give them methamphetamine, LSD, PCP, who knows what, apparently on demand, and there'll be no criminal penalties. And the rationale is this: the addicts will get their drugs free or at low cost from the government. They won't have to steal to get their drugs, crime will drop, and the cartels will go out of business. And that sounds pretty good. But let's look at it for a minute. Surely, in this controlled legalization, we're not going to give drugs to children, to minors, so we'll set them aside. We wouldn't give drugs to airline pilots, bus drivers, the doctors who are about to be kidnapped by Mexico. We're not going to give it to doctors. We're not going to give it to soldiers, to policemen. John Henry, we might give it to criminal defense lawyers, I don't know. But my point is that with controlled legalization, you still have this big black market out there of people not eligible for government-sponsored drugs. Cartels will still have a black market to deal with, and the problem will still exist. Most people who study the issue believe that if you legalize drugs, you reduce their price, increase their availability, they predict that drug usage and drug addiction will increase dramatically. Some estimates go as high as 60 million of our citizens could become drug addicted. Some of these drugs are very, very powerful, addictive drugs. Contrary to the suggestion that crime will decrease, it seems more logical that crime will increase. The heroin addict client that the government gives his heroin to, he's not going to be employed. He's going to be walking around the street doped up, and he's going to steal for his clothing, for his entertainment, for his vehicles, for whatever other appetites he has. And Mr. Hingson touched on another type of crime that will probably increase dramatically: vehicular homicide, manslaughter. The heroin client will go out, get in his car, kill a family of 5, and when he's sued, first of all, he's not going to have insurance. Secondly, he's going to say, hey, what I was doing was lawful. So then you sue the government, and the government's going to say, what? Sovereign immunity. You can't sue us. It's part of our program. The President's strategy, National Drug Strategy for this year, estimates the cost of doing nothing. They try to predict that if we did nothing, they try to estimate the cost of emergency room, increased costs for heroin overdoses and other drug overdoses, increase in AIDS due to drug addiction, increase in costs due to increased crime. And they estimate the cost of doing nothing is $76 billion. That's a lot more than the expenditures now to try and control drug abuse. Most importantly, citizens don't want legalized drugs. In study after study, vote after vote to legalize marijuana, whatever, citizens consistently are polled 4 and 5 to 1 against legalization. The last Libertarian candidate for governor ran on a platform of what? Legalize drugs in Oregon. You'll be happy to recall that he received less than 1% of the vote, hardly an endorsement for his position. Lastly, I heard Rudy Giuliani comment at one time. He's the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, now the mayor of New York City. And he asked, does anybody in the room really care that this great democracy, the United States, would consider giving heroin, cocaine, you name it, to its citizens? Democracy needs an educated citizenry to survive. We're trying to compete in a global economy. Drug legalization is wrong, it's morally wrong, economically wrong, and best of all, the people don't want it. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, for bringing this issue into sharp focus for us. It's now time to take questions from the audience to our speakers. Again, please use the microphone. We'll have two questions first from members of the board and the committee, and then we'll go on to ask from the floor. Please try to make your questions, again, 30 seconds in length, and hopefully they'll give an opportunity for our speakers to move into some rebuttal area that they didn't get under the approach that we're taking today. Our first question, I should say, is from Joanne Allen, a member of the board and assistant to Chair Bev Stein, Multnomah County. Joanne?
Good afternoon. This question is for either gentleman that would care to answer it. Of the $13.2 billion that's spent yearly, this year, on the war on drugs, can you specifically say how much of that is spent for treatment? We already know that when people go in for treatment, there's a waiting list. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact figure. I know the President's drug strategy this year appropriates approximately $300 million, is my recollection, more for treatment than has been spent in the past. The new crime bill also dedicates money to the drug courts that I mentioned in my presentation. These drug courts are catching on around the country, and the whole idea is to get people, the minute they hit the criminal justice system, get them into treatment rather than to have a lengthy trial and motion stage where they continue to use drugs or whatever. But it appropriates a good deal of money for that as well, and I don't know if the jury is still out on the drug courts, but they seem to have been very successful, at least in Multnomah County.
I can respond briefly on that. I know that during the debate that raged in Washington on the crime bill, there was one component of it that was advanced called treatment on demand. And unlike Barry, there are some addicts that want treatment, that come off the streets and say, I want some help. I've had a brother lawyer come to my house in the middle of the night asking for help from me, and I gave it, and he's clean and sober and alive. He would have been dead otherwise. But unfortunately, the treatment on demand component of the crime bill did not pass. More money for law enforcement did. There is a modest increase in the amount of treatment money available, but certainly not enough for the demand for treatment that is truly out there.
Carol Stone, City Club member. I have a question probably aimed more at John Henry Hingson. Some European countries have experimented with legalizing drugs, namely Switzerland, Great Britain, Netherlands, Spain, and Italy, and the results have shown that addiction rates have risen dramatically along with crime and with law enforcement costs. Please explain why we should even consider legalization here when this year 21 major cities in Europe signed a declaration against legalization because of the impact they have seen in their own backyards.
You know, it's so difficult for us to intelligently respond to the statistics that get floated. In order for us to be intelligent about the use of statistics, we have to have a lot more hands-on knowledge than we are able to bring to the table. I'm sure that there are a few of the people in this room that know a whole lot about the use of nuclear power. But there are very few nuclear scientists here. I see a couple of very familiar faces on that issue. But in order to understand those numbers that the proponents and the opponents of that type of an issue float out, we have to have a whole lot of knowledge about the specifics. You know, you talk about European nations. In April, the German High Court declared that marijuana, personal use of marijuana, could not be touched by the criminal sanction. And have we seen rioting in the streets in Berlin? I don't know. One thing I do know is that we have some very violent crime that's occurring. 500 kids in New York, Rudy Giuliani talked about it. 500 kids shot in New York in 1 year. It makes me sick. I'm not for violence. I'm not for crime. I think that we should be in favor of bringing a medical solution to a medical problem and prevent it.
Rob Wolf, member of City Club. I guess it's probably going to go to either one, but directed towards Barry. Something we didn't talk about, or something that wasn't brought up, is the racist basis of a lot of the laws. We're a pretty white, affluent group here, but I know there are a lot of people, especially in the poor black areas, that think that the federal government has declared war on them. I know there are substantial examples. Same amount of crack cocaine that'll get you, or regular cocaine will get you a few months in prison or in a state prison, or maybe a couple of years in federal. It'll get you a 10-year minimum if it's crack in the federal system. I also know from having done some of this drug defense that there are numerous individuals of minorities who truly believe the government is out to jail an entire generation of young black men. How do you respond to that?
Rob, I'll try and respond twofold. First of all, the legal argument is an equal protection argument, that the government somehow is not treating all its citizens equally. And the legal answer is that disparate impact does not violate the Equal Protection Clause. And every court that has addressed that issue has upheld the congressional structure for treating crack cocaine different from powdered cocaine. That's a decision Congress has made. On the other hand, when I first heard the term crack cocaine, it was about 1987. I was shown a couple of rocks by a policeman, and he said, "This stuff's going to make you love cocaine or wish you had it back." Crack cocaine has given us the drive-by shooting. It's horribly addictive. It's incredibly cheap and has been taken over by some very violent gangs. And Congress has taken the view that small amounts of crack cocaine are going to get people long periods of incarceration. The new crime bill does, however, ameliorate that a little bit. They've undone certain minimum mandatories for first-time offenders.
I'd like to respond to something that was part of that question. To tell you about the truth. Welcome to my world. If you drive north on Interstate 5 and you're Hispanic, police, prosecutors, and defense lawyers will giggle about you getting stopped for the offense of driving while Hispanic. As a result of that, the Oregon legislature has addressed the issue of forfeiture papers being served on people who only speak Spanish. But the bottom line is that our Oregon Court of Appeals has held that it was okay for police officers to walk up to two men who were standing by the trunk of their car for the sole reason that they appeared to be Mexican nationals and asked to look in the trunk. I don't want to be a part of that system.
Two related questions for Mr. Hingson. I'm Greg Kafuri. Mr. Sheldahl claims credit for the decline in the use of certain drugs. Isn't it a fact that these things come in cycles and waves, and different drugs become popular at different rates at different times? They fade, new drugs come on the horizon. And secondly, it is said that if a system doesn't work, the correct question to ask is, well, who is it working for? And so I'd ask you, who around the world and in this country benefits from the present system that we have? Thank you.
Well, in the first one, I felt like reaching for my mitt and catching it. You're right. It goes in cycles.
Bad and knock it out of the park.
Yeah. You know, we are really ignorant as a society in this country by not using the tools that we have. Social scientific tools are available to determine whether or not increasing a penalty on a certain crime has the capacity to work, whether it deters if we double the time of incarceration for robbery, do we affect the robbery commission rate? I mean, that's not too much of a question to ask, is it? But we don't. Do we have the computers to do that? But we don't. So yes, it goes in cycles, and age. The baby boomers committed some crimes because they were in the crime-committing age, and then the number of people of that age declined, and probably it didn't have a damn thing to do with effective or ineffective law enforcement or anything of that nature. It was just an artifact of demography. With respect to the second question, that's an incredibly complex, long question that we don't have time to answer. Who benefits from all of this? And my answer is quite provocative. But I want to say one thing. The position that I'm taking is to my economic detriment, and I would happily give up that amount of income today if we could really address this problem in a realistic, humane, and humanistic fashion.
Lennox Dick, City Club member, physician. Have either of you gentlemen perused the scientific literature in this subject of legalization of drugs? Have either one of you? If you haven't, if you have, there wouldn't be any debate. The scientific literature, last time I reviewed it, and I'll bring it up to date if either of you want the file. Well, I'm going to the question. I asked them, have they reviewed the scientific literature? If they have, they realize it doesn't work. Legalization will not work.
Steve Buckstein, City Club member. First of all, I'd just like to state, I think Mr. Sheldahl pointed out that many people oppose legalization out of frustration, and I'm sure that's true, but there is a strong body of philosophical and moral argument that it is not the right of a government of a free society to tell people what they put into their bodies, just like in our country, it's not the right of the government to tell us what we should read. That's the First Amendment. My question is somewhat rhetorical, but I think it's important for both of you and for the audience. Mr. Sheldahl said that some studies have found, or some people have predicted, that if we legalize drugs, that as many as 60 million adults who are not using illegal drugs now would start using them. That's nearly half of all the adults in the country. And I'm wondering, Mr. Sheldahl, if you could think or tell us which of your friends might start using illegal drugs who are not using them today. I've asked over 100 adults recently that question, and I've only found one who said that he doesn't use illegal drugs today. If they were legalized, he might, and he's a former Portland police officer. Thank you.
I can't think of any of my colleagues who are going to start tomorrow, but I can say the best evidence that reduction in price and increased availability increases addiction, and that's crack cocaine. That's probably the best example there is. Crack cocaine is cheap and became widely available, and the number of addicts has increased dramatically.
Paul Smith, trauma surgeon, guest. I've studied and debated this subject for many years. I have a couple of provocative questions, one for each panelist, that I hope will stimulate you somewhat. Number one, have you thought, with the legalized drug model, what you're going to do about prescription drugs? How are you going to have marijuana and heroin legal and penicillin requiring you to go to a doctor? That's first question. Second question is more resolution. Resolve that since the number one drug problem in this country is alcohol, including half the automobile deaths, almost all of domestic violence is alcohol related, we should therefore encourage all alcoholics to become potheads because they never overdose and they never commit domestic violence to speak of.
You search for the question and answer it. Alcohol is a drug that causes a lot more death than all of the other controlled substances combined, but nicotine kills even more. And the deaths from smoking cigarettes have decreased through education. This problem of drug abuse and use in the United States should be dealt with by the Surgeon General and not the Attorney General.
Our own line from William Bennett, he says that legalized alcohol is not a good model to progress from legalizing other drugs for the reasons I think you suggest. It kills a lot of people.
Dick Brownstein, a member of the club. Question primarily for Mr. Sheldahl. My concern and my question would be is what happens when we win the war? And by that I mean assuming that we eliminate 80% of the importation of and distribution of drugs, we'll still have the same number of addicts that we have today, and that those addicts will by necessity have to pay more because of a limited supply to maintain their addiction. And it would seem to me that the health and safety of the non-using general public will still be at risk to largely the same extent.
I really don't like the term war on drugs. It's probably a bad term for anyone to ever have used. It almost implies that we're going to win somehow total victory. I'm not that optimistic. I don't think the problem is ever going to go away totally. And in terms of interdiction, that's probably the hardest thing the government has tried to do, and that's probably where we've had our biggest failures. The border with Mexico is over 2,000 miles long. You look out at the expanses of ocean and the ingenuity of smugglers in hiding in commercial aircraft, private aircraft, human bodies, you name it, they can do it. I think the current strategy, national strategy, is to move away more from interdiction, try and focus on some of the source countries through through diplomacy, to work with Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, to see if we can accomplish some crop eradication there. And at the same time, I'm not sure we're going to get to the stage where the price of drugs is going to increase so dramatically that the crime rate will rise because addicts will have to commit more crimes to support their habit.
Don Wagner, member. If I were to believe that there would be 60 million addicts within some relatively short time after the drugs were legalized, I would be appalled. Can either of you talk about the range? I don't know, for example, how many addicts there are right now. What would lead us to believe that it's going to go up 10%, 30%, or 500%? What body of data can help us project?
Let me try a little bit of that first. I can tell you how many addicts we estimate that we have. There are about 2.1 million cocaine addicts in the country, about 600,000 heroin addicts. Maybe the 60 million figure is far-fetched, and the reason those numbers are wild estimates is that's simply what they are. We haven't tried drug legalization, and it's really an unknown. How bad will the problem get? I think the safest thing you can say is it will get worse. And what the numbers will be, I'm not sure I have an answer.
I think it's important for us as Oregonians to remember what we did with marijuana. We decriminalized marijuana in the 70s. And I didn't think that there was dancing in the streets and rioting and all that kind of stuff going on back then. Maybe they were for other reasons, but it wasn't because of the marijuana. I mean, we had some problems in this country. But, we don't treat these kinds of issues with the same scientific intelligence that we could. We don't have a control group and a test group of individual human beings that we say, okay, now you live in this county and drugs are illegal, and you live in this county and drugs are the other way. And then we're going to determine whether or not something changes in the behavior of the person. But when we hear all these numbers, again, and I don't mean to be pejorative or nasty about this, but liars always figure and figures always lie. I mean, I always just scratch my head when I hear these numbers because somebody's got an axe to grind. If I use the figures, I guarantee you I got an axe to grind. And don't trust me totally when I'm spouting off numbers.
Following that, I'll spout off some numbers. According to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and I hope that we can trust their figures.
Excuse me, could you identify yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Sandy Burbank, a guest. According to the NIDA, over 400,000 people a year die from tobacco, over 125,000 people a year die from alcohol, and prescription drugs lead to 75% of all emergency room admissions. Given those statistics and the amount of money that we're spending on just a few illegal drugs, my question to both of you is how would you feel about starting at square one, going back and studying all drugs by the same standard and coming up with something that's a lot more sane than taking people's children's jobs, property, and freedom for something like marijuana that has never killed anybody and letting people go repeatedly after they've been arrested for drunk driving? Thank you.
Marijuana is contained in Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Schedule. Our government declares it as dangerous as heroin. one of the problems that we have is credibility. Young people were told long ago that if you smoked a marijuana cigarette, you were going to rape somebody, and the next week you were going to be shooting heroin into your arms. Children were told that by our government. Reefer Madness was a movie kids watched, and it was a lie. And the problem with it is, once you've started lying to your children about something, they're not going to believe you when you tell them the stove is really hot and they're going to get burned.
Marijuana is in Schedule 1 primarily because Congress concluded it had no medicinal benefits. That's what goes into Schedule 1. Oregon did try to fool around with decriminalizing marijuana in the early 70s. We paid a pretty good price. In the middle 80s, we were the third leading domestic producer of marijuana in the country. We had marijuana growers on the public lands. They were armed with booby traps and firearms to keep people from out hiking. And fortunately, we're going in the other direction. The state legislature has increased the penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, great. I'll give it. Joyce Alvin, City Club member. I have a question for Mr. Hingson. Employers who implement alcohol and drug policies and drug testing in their workplace have seen dramatic decreases in accidents, absenteeism, and health care costs. With legalization, what is your recommendation to employers for covering costs of higher workers' compensation from accidents and injuries and lower productivity with increased numbers of drug users in the workforce?
I'm troubled by having a workforce that has no rights to be let alone. When the drug testing cases went to the United States Supreme Court, people from law enforcement were the ones that were fighting it. Once again, I was on the side of law enforcement.
Well, our time is up, and we thank you both again for a provocative debate, a discussion of a matter that we're all still searching for a definitive answer to. Appreciate your being with us. We're adjourned.